take a quick survey, just a couple minutes. We promise it's painless, it's anonymous.
You want us to do that right now?
Yeah, do it right now, or do it, you know, in the next few minutes.
Yeah.
You have it, yes.
Yeah,
okay. So it's in the chat now on Zoom. If you want to click on that, then you can take this quick survey, and we will revisit your responses at the end of this, the last 5 minutes.
As an aggregate, we won't pull out individual responses.
Right. Yeah. So my name is Lisa Arnold. I am an associate professor in the Department of English. My specialty is rhetoric and writing studies. This is my colleague, Stephen Disrud. You want to introduce yourself?
I'm a lecturer in modern languages where I do ESL stuff, mostly working with international graduate students.
So first of all, thank you so much for joining us. We're talking about negotiating language diversity in our classrooms. And so in this presentation, we're going to talk about what we mean by language diversity. We're going to go over some basic things about language that you may or may not know from a linguistics perspective. And we will talk about what that means in terms of your actual teaching. So that is what we're going to cover. So a few things linguistically to know about language, which you may or may not have a sense for. But from a linguistics perspective, there are a few key points that we can call, or Rosina Lippy-Green calls the linguistic facts of life. And she says that also, I mean, and linguists, you know, she's representing linguists as a field, that all spoken languages change over time. If you look historically, you can see that, including English, right? If we look at Shakespeare versus now, that's pretty clear, right? All spoken languages are equal. So there's not like some internal hierarchy of which languages are better than others. Grammaticality is different than communicative effectiveness. So you can still be effective as a communicator, even if you don't put a sentence together in a grammatically correct way, okay? So these are distinct and independent issues. Another thing is that written and spoken languages are historically, structurally, and functionally different things, okay? So writing is significantly different than speaking. In English, we tend to have a sense that these are the same, or that we should be writing as we are speaking, or vice versa. But these are just different things, right? You have a lot more control when it comes to writing, because you can revise, you can correct, right? You can do a lot of things, but when you're speaking, you can't take it back, right? The other thing to know is that variation in language is intrinsic to all spoken language. So it's normal to have accents, it's normal to have dialects. This is the way language works. So nothing to be afraid of. Let's see here. Okay, next slide. Okay, so that's kind of a basic thing to know. The next thing to think about is this idea of standard American English, or standard whatever kind of English you want to call it. There is an idea that standard American English exists. It's a thing. You know, you can touch it, and there it is. But the reality is that there is no such thing as so-called standard American English. This is a construction, something that we've sort of made up, and we have a name for, but it doesn't actually exist. We think that we know and recognize it, right? We believe that we can know and recognize it, and we love to correct it. The other day I got an email from someone who I don't know. She's in HR. I had to email her about something. And I assume because she saw my signature that I'm an English professor. After she emailed me with a response, she emailed me again and apologized for some grammatical error that I didn't notice. Then I had to study her email to find it, right? It was so weird. I was like, she's self-correcting because of me, you know? And so she was correcting her. We all do this, right? And if you're an English teacher, you know that people do this all the time because they do it in front of you. It's very embarrassing. But the reality is, this idea of standard American English is actually sort of an ideological thing, okay? It's a construction. We hold on to this ideology because language is a commodity. It is something that can get you something else. It has value in the world, right? And especially English is a commodity worldwide. If you go outside of an English-speaking country, you will know that or notice that the idea of English is very, there's a kind of, I call it a weight to the idea of English that actually sort of strongly, it has some kind of power. And so this idea of standard American English and having control over it or mastery of it is also something considered, like it has a power relation, right? This idea that there is a standard language or that there should be a standard language and that we should all adhere to it, it allows us to use language as something that has this power, okay? So those are important things to think about. Stephen.
Well, everything she talked about it becomes the foundation for this language bias that we bring into the classroom, right? So if we don't recognize that, going back to Lippy Green's linguistic facts of life, that language is just variable. It is just the nature of language that there is variation and diversity to it. If we don't recognize that, we tend to come into the classroom saying, okay, there is better or worse uses of language, and it's my job to make sure that the students learn the best use of language. So language bias really comes from this belief that there's an inherent quality of better or worse to certain kinds of language over the others, which is in contradiction to that linguistic point of view that we looked at earlier, and very much embedded in that ideology of standard American English. So in our context, it's this belief we have as instructors who are evaluating writing and speech too, in a way, that one variety of English, the academic English in particular, is more valuable than the rest. So that has all this sort of cascading effects on choices and actions that we have as a teacher. Thank you. So the learning environment tends to be structured around that mythology and that ideology and that bias to do the following. If we have, I think, I'm thinking about the syllabus that was analyzed in the previous one, and we have that we're in category A, we're going to create an environment and a climate that students come into and it excludes them, it silences them. If there's discussion, they're going to be less likely to enter that discussion. If my language is different than everybody else's, right? That's a major indicator of whether I belong in a group or don't belong in a group, right? This is how we know each other. This is how we know we belong together, whether it be your family language, your regional language, or the language of your social status. If you come in to a group and you recognize, somebody saying "ufta," you're like, I know you, I belong with you. But if students come into our classrooms and they are very aware that their language, the language that they use, sounds or feels or is very different from everybody around, they are excluded from the group. So they're going to be less likely to be real active participants in discussion. And they're going to see in real practical ways that students who have mastered the teacher's expectations for language are going to be favored. And then there's this general implication that there's a right and wrong way to speak and write, but also that indicates something about the way they think. There's a right and wrong way that they think. So it's one thing in sociolinguistics that we talk about is how accent creates community, creates the in and out of a community, creates boundaries of a community. So if our classrooms are communities, the way language is treated is going to be affected. Can you go to the next one? So students might be reluctant to speak. They might anticipate exclusion. They might actually experience exclusion. And I think this is the interesting point. They might write the bare minimum. They might fear mistakes. They might fear, right? So one thing that we need students to do in general is not to be risk averse, to take some chances and to be challenged and to challenge themselves. But if they're risk averse with their language, it's going to have major impacts on what they make out of the class. For writing, there might be a focus on the mistakes, both from the student's perspective and the teacher's perspective. Like the role that the teacher has in feedback, if you are looking to enforce the SAE, the Standard American English methodology, you're going to be looking for deviations from that, right? As errors. It's your focus on feedback is going to be about correcting those errors. And that actually gets in the way of focusing on what's more important, whether that be content issues or general genre issues or whatever. And students are going to respond in kind. They might have an error-free paper, and I'm sure many of us have seen error-free writing that is just not worth all that much. But if we're focused on those errors, they're also going to focus on those errors. So it's going to have, again, those cascading effects on what happens in the classroom. So that's the main point. So what do we do about that is where we go next.
So let us talk about language diversity, what it is. What do we mean when we talk about language diversity? It just means that there's differences in language among speakers, including regional and cultural dialects. Some good examples, that you can think of are the difference between, for example, a New Jersey accent and a Minnesota accent, right? Or a Canadian accent, right? We all know these differences pretty easily. Also, African American vernacular English, which is considered a dialect in its own right, is a really important dialect to know about and be aware of. But so that's, there's always language diversity in our classrooms. Okay, that's something really important. When we actually promote and recognize this linguistic diversity, we actually are promoting a better and more positive learning environment. What we can do is, by doing that, by promoting it, by valuing it, by expressly saying, hey, I recognize that there are different languages here, and no single language is better than the other. What we end up doing is actually helping equalize that classroom space, and hopefully also eliminate or at least avoid that linguistic bias that gets in the way of our students really fully being able to express themselves in our classrooms. So as educators, we have some goals and responsibilities that I imagine we can all agree on, which is, first of all, we all want to ensure an equitable and safe learning environment for our students, right? We want to respect and value the experiences of our students and also their identities, right? We want to teach students the content we intend for them to learn while also respecting their linguistic and cultural identities. So in other words, as we teach content, we also want to make sure that they feel included and a sense of belonging in our classrooms, so that they can understand that content well and be able to not have some kind of cognitive or emotional or some kind of psychological block to being able to understand that content. We also want them to, so those are sort of, I think, basic things that we probably can all agree on. On the right, we have some goals and responsibilities that we think being aware of linguistic bias can move us towards, which is being aware that there is a myth associated with this idea of standard language, right? Like that it isn't actually some natural thing. It isn't some inherent, description of what English is, but it's actually something that we've constructed and that we use to sort of wield power in our classrooms and our lives. So if we are aware that this is a myth, that's an ideology, if we are aware of those effects, and also that if we are aware that language diversity exists and that it's valuable, then that is a huge step in the process of creating an inclusive classroom. And then planning courses, like when you're actually putting together your syllabus or creating assignments that actually go against that language bias, that don't necessarily say, place a high, an extremely high value on whatever it is that we call grammatically correct. And instead we, for example, place value on communicative effectiveness. That helps resist that language bias. It also helps recognize and promote language diversity. what do linguistically inclusive classrooms actually look like? And we have some more ideas, more concrete ideas, I think, that we can discuss at the end of this. But first of all, your course materials can actually explicitly say, hey, I recognize that there are different ways to use English. And so in this classroom, I'm going to, value that at certain levels, right? Second of all, just learning about our students can help us, right? Knowing where they come from, who they are, right? Like, what is their linguistic background, right? What might be interfering with their ability to speak clearly in the way that we expect, right? Or to write clearly. And how, just learning about those backgrounds can help us actually treat our students as individuals with identities that are important. We can be better listeners. This is something you can that's really important and you can train yourself to do, is actually, when someone has an accent, instead of just sort of resisting that accent, saying they don't speak clearly or whatever, actually opening up your brain and saying, hey, what is it that they're saying? Let me see if I can, reformulate that in terms that I can understand. And, I think we can all be better at that. And recognizing also that we may have resistance to accents, right? Because of our own sort of culturally ingrained biases. We can provide multiple opportunities for drafting, feedback from instructor and peers, and revision. And this is especially important with writing, right? And we're writing teachers, so this is something we talk about all the time. But even if you have low stakes, or small writing assignments or short answers, or, you ask students to write a paragraph in response to a test question, actually giving students time and opportunities to actually get better at those things is extremely important when it comes to language diversity. And then actually focusing when you're assessing students, when you're at the grading point, right, or giving feedback point, actually assessing what they're learning rather than extra things that for whatever reason you've decided that are important, but actually aren't important in terms of what the content of the class is, right? So focusing on what they are learning in class, it can be extremely important. So
can we speak to this a little bit more? Just generally speaking, the error-driven attitude that many instructors take to language is the biggest thing that gets in their way of assessing what this real learning that's going on. And it's the same with better listeners. There are multiple studies in ESL that talk about how to get past an accent. And usually it just requires a listener to take on a minor cognitive load. And the truth is, most of this is affected by the likability of the other person, whether you like the person enough to actually try and listen to them. And if you don't like them, you don't. And then you say, oh, they have a foreign accent. But we as teachers, if we can generally like our students or see them, see the responsibility to understanding them as partly our own, you'll be able to, and this goes for writing too, both for listening and reading. Yeah.
I have a question, if that's okay.
yeah,
So as an instructional designer, we work with faculty, and what came to mind was like a discussion rubric. So would you have any suggestions on if we're working with, instructors and they're doing a rubric for a discussion, how would you incorporate some of the things that you're talking about? Because we see a lot of them, column A, good grammar, this many errors, blah, blah, and then the rubric
for discussion. Oh, you mean
yeah, like for a
like
discussion.
an online discussion,
Yeah,
like
like-
on Blackboard.
Yeah, so do you have any suggestions or ideas that we could approach a rubric in a better way?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Well, I mean, from the last presentation, I think carrots, not sticks,
Yeah.
to design it, counting up towards what they're doing well. I saw evidence of this good thing or that good thing or
So
that
if
good
you're
thing.
understanding the content,
Yeah.
maybe
So
applying the theory.
The deficiency orientation is what's really what reinforces language bias. This idea that there is a perfect language and we're going to count down from that, whether that be on online discussions or oral discussions or writing. The deficiency approach is what reinforces the bias that we're talking about.
Right.
So if you can reconstruct that rubric or the way you're assessing and evaluating to not be deficiency oriented, but like give credit to what's being done well.
Yeah, and a lot of times, you know, what I advise faculty to do and think about is, you know, for a discussion, this is low stakes usually. I
Right.
mean, like it should be. You know, if what you're asking is for students to exchange ideas and ask good questions and, you know, think through whatever material or apply a material to some real life situation and discuss it. I mean, this isn't, you know, this shouldn't be a high stakes thing. So my big question would be, why in that situation would you ask students also to be concerned about grammar, right? Adding that is an extra cognitive thing that isn't about understanding content, right? Now, something like is, you know, it does need to be comprehensible or full sentences. I mean, I feel like that is more specific, like, because grammar can be many different things. And also there are different interpretations of grammar, right? Like, I can say, well, you need a comma in order to separate a dependent clause from an independent clause.
And I wouldn't even call that grammar, right? So,
Okay, yeah,
like when
yeah.
you're talking about the comma, I say, well, that's mechanics. Let's, you know,
Right,
let's,
exactly,
let's
yeah.
make a fine
And people
distinction.
have different definitions of that and different ideas of what that means, you know, and also language is constantly changing, even written language is changing. And so I think thinking about like, what do we specify what we mean by grammar? Does it mean full sentences, right? Like whatever that means, right? Like, or 3 full sentences or a paragraph, I don't know. But like being more specific about exactly what we mean so that also students, like that is that stick, right? That's hanging over the student's head, especially a student who comes from a stigmatized linguistic background or cultural background. That is going to take up such a higher cognitive load for them in doing something that should be really low stakes and engaging with the content. And instead they're worried about grammar. Is that really what, you know,
Well,
as a
and-
faculty member, you want them to achieve,
And
right?
there's strong reasons to say that is not what you should be worried about anyway. I mean, if you look at professional standards in the field, so over the last couple of years, I've done sort of collaborative projects with my graduate students on looking at sort of the highest credited scientific journals, what is it? Cited journals, journal articles. They're not grammatically perfect, not by a long shot.
Mhm.
But I mean, I'm talking about articles published in Nature, not some dinky little articles here or there, but there are problems with the language there, but these are still extremely well-respected articles. So why are we sweating over, you know, for grading and evaluating them is one thing. But I mean, on the other hand, I think there's nothing wrong with giving feedback to say, well, you know, this could be clear if you did this or that or the other. So, I mean, I wouldn't shy away from giving assessment, informative assessment, feedback related to language use, but why put those stakes on it when they don't make any sense?
Yeah. Well, and another thing that I would add is that I know that studies have shown that as students are understanding content for the first time, if they're new ideas or a new genre they're working in, and like no matter what their language background is, and all of us, the first time we are writing in a new situation or grappling with a new idea, our grammar breaks down. It's the last thing we are thinking about and should think about in those situations, right? And a discussion board, you would think, is a place where they're experimenting with new ideas, right? So if they don't have mastery already over the content, then thinking about grammar also is, I mean, it really distracts from.
And the metaphor of the discussion board. I mean,
Right.
we do not make those judgments in verbal conversation.
Yeah.
We don't do that.
Yeah.
We simply don't do that.
And online stuff makes it, so we are judging those things,
Yeah,
yeah.
because it gets transformed into writing, all of a sudden we get to
Yeah.
judge it in ways that we wouldn't in a face-to-face discussion.
Right. Do we have survey results?
Yeah.
Okay, survey results. Tell us about them.
International students, this is our
What was the
concern.
question here?
Who do you think this affects?
Who does this affect?
Or
Yeah.
who be more inclusive,
Yeah.
or is this going to benefit for you
Uh-huh.
guys? International students.
Mhm.
That's not a surprise at NDSU. We don't have a ton of any measurement of diversity except for
Mhm.
international students. So I think we can just see we share that.
I like this last one, all students. Most
Yeah.
people agreed with that.
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, in general, inclusive teaching is good for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there another slide? Okay,
Yeah,
next
so the other thing is, I mean, most people are saying research papers.
Yeah,
That's where these issues really come up, and we might struggle with that.
Mhm.
I think speaking to that issue, we just focus on genre and content. And, you know, we can deal with expression, but it needs, or grammar, whatever, word choice, however you want to frame it. But we deprioritize that to what's really, really important, even though, and I think this is the instructional thing, it's like easiest to make the grammar corrections and say, that's my feedback.
Yeah.
But, you know, hold off, hold back, look at the big picture.
Yeah, Jamie.
One issue I had in the fall with my half international students, half native speakers.
This is a writing class, right?
Yes, is creating an environment where they felt like other students were taking the time to listen to them. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And they felt like they were just, everyone checked out when they started to speak if they had an accent or.
Well, but this has to do with that cognitive load I talked about earlier.
let Jamie-
People
No,
check.
I'm wondering like how you know, I can take the time to listen and, you know, do the things we're talking about. How do I get
Get this-
students to do
Yeah,
that?
sure.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I just heard it more than once, you know, I can tell that students check out when I start to speak, they don't try to listen. Do you know what I mean? How do I get them to do what I'm trying to do? Does that make sense? Do you guys have
Yeah.
any tips or? have-
Well, I'll tell you what the research shows, but this is kind of, it's not a clear and easy answer. The research shows that if the personal interaction is a pleasant one, that people are more likely to take on that cognitive load of listening. But I mean, what you do as a teacher is say, well, be a more pleasant person. But
Yeah,
but to create a more, you know, the most socially conducive environment possible, I think, is the only thing that you can, I mean, that's what the research in oral communication and ESL suggests is the most powerful indicator of whether
So-
people get past accents or
So
not.
helping students form interpersonal relationships
yeah.
is gonna allow them to communicate better with those.
I think I was always
people.
focused on what I was doing and not how they felt
Sure.
about just the class in
Yeah.
general
I
until
think-
this
The
last fall.
affective
Yeah.
environment for
Yeah.
the students. would be-
Well, and I would say also just being explicit about like your own valuing of linguistic diversity in the classroom, or that your desire to, you know, like not like to make sure everybody can be included, et cetera. I think that can, I mean, that you are setting the tone for the classroom in that situation,
you
and
can-
that's a really great first step.
Okay.
Yeah,
I mean, you can explicitly say,
yeah,
I value language diversity. I
Right.
want to hear these different
right.
accents and voices. It's
Yeah.
cool and
Okay.
showing a model, but
Yeah.
the affective environment is the most important predictor.
Okay, it seems we are out of time.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for coming. Let us know if you have any questions.